think it was Paulo Freire said that education requires hope. If without hope, there is no education. But it's hard to feel hopeful when you look out and there's a lot of things to be very anxious and stressed and uncertain about. And yet, there people, even in the darkest hours, have found ways of having critical hope, which is not naive and just optimism in the face of daunting odds. It's actually thinking about what can we do, how do we come together, even at the micro level, to make change.
Welcome to Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Heather Shea. In today's episode of the podcast, I am joined by the authors of a new book, Activism, Burnout, and Community in Higher Education, Narratives of College Student Activists. This groundbreaking work delves into the intersection of student activism and well-being, weaving together personal stories, research insights, and practical recommendations. We discuss the emotional and systemic challenges student activists face and the crucial role of collective care and strategies for fostering environments that balance activism and well-being. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We hope you'll find these conversations make a contribution to the field and are restorative to the profession. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays, and you can find us at studentaffairsnow.com, on YouTube, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. And we have recently joined Blue Sky. You can find us at stuaffairsnow.bluesky.social. This episode is sponsored by Evolve. Evolve helps senior leaders release fear, gain courage, and take action for transformational leadership through a personalized, cohort-based virtual learning experience. Today's episode is also sponsored by Simplicity. A true partner, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life with technology platforms that empower institutions to make data-driven decisions. As I mentioned, I am your host for today's episode, Heather Shea. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am broadcasting from the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples, otherwise known as East Lansing, Michigan, home to Michigan State University, where I work. So let's get on with the conversation.
Hi, I'm Shia Chen, and I'm an associate professor of integrative studies from George Mason University. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and so nice to meet you all and having us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Graciela.
Absolutely. Greetings, everyone. My name is Graziella Pagliarulo-McCarran, and I'm an associate professor in leadership studies, also at George Mason University School of Integrative Studies. And I'm graduate faculty in the higher ed program. I'm really delighted to be here. So thanks so much for having us.
Absolutely. And Julie, welcome back to Student Affairs Now.
Thank you. And thanks to Heather for always hosting these generative, delicious spaces. Thank you. My name is Julie Owen. It's going to be like a theme. I'm also an associate professor in the School of Integrative Studies. My focus is on leadership studies and civic engagement and gender studies. Also, I'm a program faculty with the higher education program.
And finally, Steve, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Heather, for having us. I'm really honored to be your longtime listener, first-time caller. Steve Grandy, my pronouns are he, him, his, and I am an assistant professor in graduate psychology at James Madison University. I oversee our higher education and student affairs graduate program.
Well, so awesome to have you all joining the podcast conversation today to talk about your new book, the new book, Activism, Burnout, and Community in Higher Education, Narratives of College Student Activists. So I thought maybe we'd start with just a little bit about the book. It as I was reviewing the webpage, and we'll put a link in our show notes, I feel like this book really offers an important exploration of the intersection between activism and well-being, which is one of the topics that I don't know that we've embraced as much, right? We kind of talk about the who and the what, but not about the why and the how. And so this blending of narrative, data, and practical recommendations is really valuable. Share, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind the project and how the four of you came together to create this, and why center student voices in this way?
Thank you so much, Heather, for such a kind introduction. And I would say the spark for this project came during a conference when I had a conversation with an activist who shared that activism is lonely. And that statement struck me like a lightning bolt. It was so raw and so honest, and it planted the seed for this project. And thankfully, Dr. McCarran, Dr. Owen, and Dr. Grandis, they joined me soon after this. And what began as a kind of a simple idea grew into one of the most rewarding intellectual journeys of our lives, at least for me. And I have to say, this book is a product of collaboration and friendship. The four of us from very diverse disciplinary backgrounds and two different institutions, we came together with a shared passion for research, for activism, for student development, and for well-being. But along the way, we were supported by an incredible community of students, scholars, and practitioners. It truly took a village. Actually, two funded research projects, dozens of dedicated student research assistants, and support from colleagues across George Mason University, James Madison University, and William and Mary to bring this project to life. And it's hard. This book centers student voices because they are the driving force behind it. Their love, their labor, their unwavering commitment to creating positive social change inspire us at every step of this process. And this was more than a research project. It was a team effort and a deep respect for the transformative power of student activism. And I think Dr. McCarran have more to share in terms of the book's design.
Well, I don't know that I can say much more after that incredible sort of encapsulation. And to echo, share, the students really sit at the heart of this. Not one page, not one word, not one breath was taken without sort of thinking about them, their impact, and sort of the beating heart between all of in the work that we were doing. So the book is six or so chapters, and it really thinking it more about it like a journey, sort of, how we came to the work, sort of, how we thought about our methodology, how we tried to be really intentional about the students, the student voices, and the institutions included. So the book represents about 119 student voices, but 12 plus institutions across Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic area, Virginia, DC, Maryland, looking at religiously affiliated colleges and universities and large public and HBCU, and really trying to be careful about bringing as many folks to the table as we could. And that took us through this understanding of, how the students viewed, the benefits of their student activism, benefits in quotes, and Steve will say more about that, the costs, certainly, where they found themselves in terms of their identity, what that meant for their engagement with the larger community, and then finally sort of the so what, is sort of how we wrap up the book. So we look forward to talking a little bit about some of those pieces more specifically.
What an incredible tribute, though, to have this book that kind of tells this larger story. And I think whenever research processes turn themselves into these beautiful kind of narratives, I think that's so valuable to both the participants as well as to you all as authors. So thank you for doing that. Graziella, I'm going to stay with you for just a moment, because I do think what's interesting, and I've noticed this in my own work on my campus, is the direct connection between activism and identity. And how might I, as a student affairs practitioner, support students whose activism is really directly tied to how they see themselves, their sense of self, right? And so, when I'm engaging in activism that's tied to something that's so deeply rooted as my identity, that can be really emotionally taxing. And also, if the institution doesn't value that, what are they also saying about me in particular? So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, such an easy question that you just asked, Heather. But what I think we've wrestled with from the moment we all kind of got got on this journey together, and one of the pieces that came up continuously, and I think hopefully comes across in the text, is that the primary focus in this idea of student activist is that first word, student, right? And so we honor the holism of the person, that they're doing this incredible work, often burdensome and labor heavy and labor intensive, because often the students with minoritized identities are doing the work to support and advocate for other students with minoritized identities. And so kind of doing the labor as you are bearing sort of the systemic silencing that comes with it. And so kind of thinking through what's at the heart of this, and it really is student. And our charge as institutions of higher education and education in general, right, is to care for the student. So how do we think about that in its simplest terms? We don't want to erase the activism part. No, we want to uplift that, but we want to be really, really clear that we're dealing with human beings who have needs, who are on a development journey of their own, development journey that's psychosocial in nature and cognitive in nature and identity in nature, right? So as student affairs professionals, faculty, all of us together in this community of educators, sort of recognizing where the human could be on their journey, right? Where the needs are. And first and foremost, understanding that the student is at the part of in this equation of student activist care, is sort of the first piece. The second piece is sort of doing a bit of our own work around self-audit, right? It's really hard to care for someone else and to take in the needs of a student activist if their work, their mission is counter to our own ideologies, or is counter to the sort of the system that we work in, right? So how do we as individuals sort of think about our own biases, our own assumptions, where we stand in concert with or contradiction with this particular student's journey, and how do we do some reflexive practice around that, sort of to make meaning out of who we are, where we are, in the hope of being better at our jobs, right? As student development folks really interested in creating connection and sort of long-term growth. So I don't know if that did any work to answer the question, but I think, essentially this idea of student first, always. And then having a recognition that we're carrying our own baggage around this student first mentality, right? And sort of how do we reconcile that?
Wow. Steve, what would you add?
Yeah, well, thanks, Heather. I think one thing, just to add even some additional context, is even though the participants of this study didn't always refer to themselves as activists, they were doing activism kind of work. They were, working on efforts that were focused on the public good, working with recently arrived immigrants and refugees, reducing injustice in the prison system, promoting climate justice, working on anti-racism, and a host of other kinds of issues. And they were always working to restore justice. And whether it was on or off campus, that was a focus. And it was also focused on, it was change oriented. And often, as already Cher and Graziella have alluded to, it was at a cost to their mental health. So I think it's just important to put that context out there, but also that this book was, as you noted, Heather, that we're focused on the intersection between activism and well-being, and that there are often these benefits that students get from being part of activist efforts. But that's a contentious notion in a way to frame this as beneficial, as activism as beneficial. And so we had some good conversations amongst us based on what we were hearing from the participants about being cautious about how we frame that. And if we approach students as, tell us about the benefits of how great it is to be an activist, right? The motivation for students is not about, I want to learn leadership skills or how to critique leadership, or I'm going to, really mature and develop communication skills and 21st century skills, or I'm going to become better at civic action. We saw all those things and more. However, if we approach students more about their motivation around restoring justice, around the content and the thrust of their efforts, we're much more likely to have a respectful conversation and validate their efforts, as opposed to framing this as this is really benefiting the campus. And so we have to step outside. I think that's just adding on to really what Graziella was saying. We have to step outside of our own kind of frame to make sure we really understand where students are coming from around this activism.
Really well said. Anyone else have thoughts that they want to add? Julie, I saw you nodding vigorously throughout that.
Yes, well, so I'm echoing everything my esteemed colleague said here. I think it's really interesting how students come to the work and the ways that they approach the work. I feel like some of the research, the Quay et al., there's amazing meta-analysis and showed that actually the context of the students' communities actually shapes their activism, right? So it's not just a thing that's in isolation. It's actually shaped by the culture of the institutions that they're at and the culture of the institutions that they are working for and on behalf of. And so this idea that it's not a monolithic thing, it is composed of individuals, but also that these systemic structures even shape the way activism appears, is received, and experienced, whether it's a burnout thing or whether it's a resilience building tool or whether it's a change making tool, all depends on this complex formula. So I thought that was sort of interesting too.
Yeah, Graziella.
Sort of Julie kind of thinking through this idea of interaction with the systems, with the structures, student identities themselves, right? And not only how they see themselves as activist or advocate or organizer, or Eugene, who just does some good work, right? That they're the complexity that comes with intersectionality and multiple intersecting identities and that interaction with the system, and that being motivation, but also that bringing sadness, and sadness then bringing motivation. So all the ways in which these sort of micro and macro environmental interactions sort of drive the types of work that the students do and why they do it. And I just, so appreciate you bringing that back into the loop, Julie.
I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, the piece that this is so interestingly connected to is this cost and burnout, and the ways in which this really takes a toll on students, and I imagine then, of course, not just to their physical well-being and their mental health, but also to their academics, right? And if we're centering students, how do we do that in such a way that students are able to continue and we're not seeing them also leaving our institutions, and that's also counterproductive, right? Shara, I would love to hear a little bit about kind of this non-negotiable, like what are the costs of both time and burnout associated with student activism, and if there are examples of ways in which your participants spoke to cultivating environments that could foster more well-being without placing these additional burdens on top of their already overwhelmed lives, right, between school and about the issues that they're so passionate.
Thank you, Heather, for the question. And I think I will just use a quote from a student activist said in the book to give you an idea how burnout has become a theme among student activists we interviewed. One said that it got so exhausting at burnout. And just hearing stories like that is truly heartbreaking. And I would say that student activists burnout, through our study, we find out that they are from a combination of individual, community, and institutional factors. So that means that the effective interventions must also address all these levels. And that say, I have to emphasize, institutional factors often play a very significant role. Actually, Graziella and I, we were deeply inspired by the experience of a student activist, and we tried to create a one-stop virtual resource hub to support them. But over the years, we have encountered, I would say, inaction and sometimes resistance from institutional leadership. And so this highlights a critical need for universities and colleges to adopt a more open-minded and supportive approach to student activism. I think at a minimum, universities should implement formal training programs to help student activists manage burnout. For example, resources, I mean, they are available out there. Those like the Human Rights Resilience Project, right? So they have a toolkit. Those actually could provide practical strategies for building and maintaining well-being. But ultimately, what I want to emphasize is that campuses need to take proactive steps to support our student activists rather than placing the burden on them, on student activists, to identify and to advocate for the resources they need. So the other way around, right? So really, it's on the universities, it's on the institutions to do more work, and they are already overwhelmed. And as Heather you mentioned, so they should not bear the additional responsibility of ensuring their own well-being. And institutions, I hope they can recognize that burnout doesn't just impact activists themselves, students themselves. It also affects the communities and causes they serve. So I hope we can foster a culture of support and prioritize well-being at institutional level. And universities and colleges can therefore create environments where we could see activism and self-care coexist, and we could see we promoting the holistic development of student activists, as Grazia mentioned, right? So, and we could try to empower them to sustain their work for positive social change through just prioritizing their work, prioritizing the support system for them. I hope I addressed the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was thinking about this with relation again to my own work, my recent role working with women in gender equity spaces, and I'm thinking about the offices and units that need to almost coordinate at the institutional level, right, to manage this idea of well-being for student activists, because student activists have to go through one office to have their protests, right, like whatever registered. So make sure that we have the supports in place to support their activism. But then the well-being office, how often are they looped into that process, right? And checking in. And then I'm also thinking about the leadership development folks, and so institutionally there's some really interesting overlaps that we might need to think through. Yeah, Julie, that sparked something for you.
Yes, I was going to say we're so fortunate. Three of us are at George Mason University outside of in Virginia, outside of DC. We have an office for well-being, and they are sort of for student well-being, and they are like brought into these kinds of conversations. And they develop some cool tools like a resilience badge that students can do, where they learn, a self-paced kind of program to learn about resilience, and then sort of we still need to take it one step farther and say, what does resilience look like in the context of activism? But it's so nice to have that we do have campus support for some of this, and some of it just connecting the populations with the resources that already do exist, I think is one of our challenges. Sorry, you're getting the animal action in the background.
We love the cats coming
That's
up.
right.
So great. Yeah, Steve.
Well, and just to add to that, I think to have these different departments respond to students, because Heather, I think you're right. This is such a decentralized type of experience for students. There's not the activism office, right? And there ought not be, right? But there are these other places, from civic engagement to well-being, et cetera. But it means a philosophical shift on the part of a campus from looking at activism, whether it's on or off campus, that it's not only an annoyance, but there's a different motivation for students often than there are for the campus. So the students are focusing on fairness that's inherent in systems, and administrators are often charged with upholding those same systems. So it's inherently conflictual. So we can continue to talk about that, but I think we have to kind of overcome that initial philosophical barrier to think about how we actually serve activists.
Yeah, Graziella.
Steve, your thought about annoyance and, just sort of disturbers makes me think a lot about Linda's work that underpinned so many of the conversations we had as a team and really gave us such incredible heart for the book. And there has to be a choice between you're either a campus troublemaker because you're rallying against the administration, or you're not a troublemaker because your activism is outside of the campus. And so we're good with that, right? So, but helping sort of bridge that at the center of that, again, going back to my very same theme of there's a human being, right? There is a student, and the same rules apply with respect to student development and student care. And one group that I'd love to kind of bring into, the cast is really looking at student affairs folks, but I'd love to bring faculty in, right? Because amazing things can happen in the classroom that support student activism, that sort of help create well-being through placemaking and the I belong and I matter, because I can write about the work that I do and I can translate the work that I like to do into a presentation, or I can take what I'm learning in class in terms of theoretical elements and then I can apply it, or I can, there's this space for learning and creating connections, doing civic engagement work or community-based work, or kind of in connecting. But I don't want to say too much about that because Julie's our super expert, but just something that you made me think about, Steve.
Yeah, really well said. I've thought a lot about like the ways in which we frame different activists as troublemakers. And I think, you all just kind of spoke to that. It's like if the subject of the activism is based in somebody's identity, and they are working from a place of this is part of my own humanity, versus I'm an environmental activist and, I care about this thing. And then we see those folks as, doing all this incredible service learning, focus work and yes, and right. Like, why does there have to be that? And Chris Linder's work, as you mentioned, is really, really strong and kind of, setting that up in a way that makes us as administrators go, wait a second, who are the troublemaker activists, and what kind of lens am I thinking about that through? So Julie, I'm gonna move to you now, because I think that the topic of well-being and the way that we speak about that often does kind of go into this self-care, right? And I think in the book you discuss the concept of bridging self-care and collective care or community care. And I'm curious about maybe, again, some of those institutional structures that might help address or promote that collective care. Because I think when we think about that individual at the center of all of this and the loneliness, that Cher also spoke about, how can we better help students together think about their communities and how that might balance activism with well-being?
Yeah, and I think what makes this so interesting is that, we didn't just sit here and brainstorm these great ideas for institutions and students, but it comes from the data. So Cher and Graziella had gathered these 100+ interviews. And so the students told us what they wanted from institutions, right? So they said communities, institutions can be a source of identity, belonging, support, or they can exacerbate feelings of martyrdom and betrayal. And as Chris Linder and Freyd's, institutional betrayal can actually, re-traumatize students. So which is it, right? Does it have to be binary either or? Usually there's a spectrum there, right? So I thought that was super interesting that the students were like, if only we could see how if institutions better supported us, then we would be sort of better representatives of them and for them in the long term. And seeing those interconnections between the individual and institutional became super important. I think we've talked about a lot of them. We talked about programs institutions can do, even things like yoga and meditation for activists. That's the kind of stuff that I'm like, does that work? But students, those came from students. We want those kinds of things. We want people to recognize that we're coping with stress a result of this, and we can either burn out or we can stay engaged, and you can help us stay engaged. And then Graziella talked a little bit about embedding some of this in classrooms and curricula. That's been super effective, at least in my own experience. So, I teach women in leadership. It's the day after the election. what do I do? You can't just skip that topic in a class that's talked about leadership and gender. And so really realizing, I ended up showing a video about the ways that certain identities were ignored by the Democratic Party, and then had students react to the video versus to their own feelings necessarily, and actually it's really effective, right? It was able to sort of leverage diverse discussions, and because it was about a piece of content instead of about kind of people's emotions. But students left and said, I really need to talk and process this, and I didn't know I needed this, and no other classes talked about the election this week so far. And so, how do we embed in ways that are inclusive of multiple viewpoints? I think students are craving community. They're craving having these dialogues. So embedding it in a classroom and curricula. I teach a activist research methods class. So teaching students that research can be a form of activism and might be a healthy way to channel their activism versus burning down the dining hall or like whatever they might be doing. There might be some ways that they can use tools. So once they see that their passion is noticed and can be funneled in certain ways, that they might have more effect on policy if they use a research lever or a writing lever versus a more traditional activist strategy. So help sort of see that. And I think we forget this, but training mentors, advisors, anybody to sort of who interacts with students to actually be on the lookout for burnout and martyrdom complexes. Are we recognizing those signs in students, especially when they do or don't trigger us by their alignment with our own identities that people have talked about? Overall, what we heard, and I don't just stop me if I'm not summarizing this well, my colleagues, but was that students really just want to be listened to and taken seriously by institutions, and they want to be part of crafting the solution. So they don't want institutions to sort of there, that was nice, and then go on and, with not include them in those non-transparent spaces and places. So whatever we can do to do that, to me, that's the ultimate way to bridge the individual and the community, is to not just try to wait students out. I mean, institutions are scared often of students wanting deep change, because deep change has like both political and personal costs to institutions often. And so like, how do we really treat them as partners and not just sort of cogs in the neoliberal machine? I mean, I think that's what we've heard time and time again. So I think I rambled on, but I think I'm going to stop there. There's more to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Graciela, what would you add?
It really just reminded me of this idea of, there's sort of three parts to mattering, right? We're noticing the student activists. We notice them on the quad, we notice them, in the dining hall, but are we actually engaging them? So to be in the students actually, the participants spoke exactly to that. Like, they know we're around, but nobody's actually inviting us to talk to them. So that's sort of that, making that differentiation between we know they're here versus how can we kind of make them feel fully present, fully incorporated into the fabric of the institution. One piece I will add that sort of was top of mind for a number of the students we spoke with around activism, advocacy, organizing, is the privileging of certain types of activism. So Julie, talking about research is activism, teaching is activism, and so kind of this sense of I'm undeserving of well-being because I'm not at the front lines with my poster. I do the buttons in the back room, and I'm the one that preps all the folks before they go out, and I download all the legal forms. Like, that's the stuff that I'm doing, so that really doesn't count. So well-being for me, I don't know that I even get a chance to work. So really being clear, as not only student affairs folks, but sort of institutional agents writ large, that activism, organizing, advocacy looks different for every student. And just because it looks different doesn't mean that they are hurting any less or needing any less.
Yes.
And so something to be thoughtful about, particularly when we then connect that to students with minoritized identities who are then saying, I'm the button maker. Like, you are carrying both an identity that's pushed to the margins, and you're doing activism work, and both of those things are carrying a weight from an institutional perspective. So what do we do to support you? Just kind of one thing that sort of popped in.
Yeah, there's all things, right? All things require time and energy, and just because there's a visible component, right? People showing up on the quad or at our campus by the rock, right? Like, it's not always those folks who maybe need the care. or need the recognition too, right? So, Steve, I'm really curious. I know on my campus at least, student activists, one, they're kind of taken for granted. Two, they're kind of seen as a pain. But I think their contributions are really valuable. I mean, we have a new multicultural center that's being built at Michigan State because of student activism that started, decades ago, but really in the last 10 years. And so what are some tangible ways that we can recognize, formally, kind of reward activism and as a form of leadership, but also of an engagement and really like make the institution kind of recognize that these contributions are really valuable?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Heather. That's a great question. Yeah, I think part of that really goes back to what our colleagues here, but also who preceded us and all the great work that's been done in student affairs literature and beyond that. But certainly there's been great work, as we've acknowledged, but has talked about that acknowledgement of students and validating them. And sometimes what that means, this goes back to what others have said already in this conversation, is it means having that conversation with students where we go in with a mentality of validation and we talk about what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? And that also means some transparency on our part about our own motivations as well. And so the students, the participants of this study were very empathic. They cared deeply, but sometimes they wouldn't understand necessarily the whole context because no one's shared that with them. So when administrators are feeling that tension between a board of trustees and a president and other stakeholders, parents that are pressing upon them, students often weren't given the benefit to understand those kinds of pressures. And so they felt forced into there's nothing else we can do. As we've noted, students often feel like if this issue, if I don't speak up, this is life and death for some families I'm working with, for instance. And so I have to speak up. And so they feel painted in a corner. And so part of what we can do as faculty and administrators is creating not only a space for conversation about what tools are at your disposal and that are going to accomplish your goals, but also some real openness about what might be going on. Why might you be facing resistance? And then what might be the most effective tool at actually addressing that? And I think then that also potentially opens up that conversation about that sense of martyrdom. And for our students, Sherry, you can talk more about this as well. But that sense that students are going to feel like if I don't speak up, then something really dramatic and terrible could happen, which is true that their voice is critical to this. I mean, we've seen it, and so it was interesting that students often said that. And then just interestingly too, a number of students also compared themselves to Greta Thunberg is how you pronounce it in the U.S. or Greta Thunberg. And so, well, I'm not Greta. And this goes back to what Graciela was saying. It's like sometimes diminishing that at the same time that they are devoted so heavily to this issue. And so if we can get past, Heather, what you were saying, that some administrators feel like this is an annoyance because sometimes students aren't following the rules. Like we have this rule, you first have to reserve the space. You can't just show up, right? Right. And so if we have to be able to get past, doesn't mean we have to throw the rules out the window, but we can be understanding at the same time and not just get caught up in that the students are being naive or rash. If they're feeling painted in the corner, we can be more expansive and on how we respond as educators.
Yeah, I'm sure I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, and I feel like our student activists, they really want to be part of something greater, something good. Yeah, and then they want to be heard, they want to be present, and they want to be able to communicate their ideas to the larger community, either their peers or the institutions and the leadership. And as Steve summarizes so well, yeah, so I mean, maybe if the institutions and administrators could share all the dilemmas they're in, and I think that is a very very genuine first step to reach out to our students and saying like, oh, our hearts with you, but just we are constrained by so many factors here, but your well-being is our priority, and I think that actually makes huge difference. And one of our kind of a research article out of this big project is about like a matter, and and Grazia could talk about this more, but this idea of being involved and being pay attention to, I think really help uh, their sense of belonging a lot. So I didn't emphasize this part of kind of from the institution reaching out to the students and then sharing their experience could be part of the kind of a larger process of kind of a bringing this could be troublemaker student actives community and the institution at times they are challenged by this community. So I think I'm really hoping from my personal perspective and then from the findings of this study is institutions could do more, could reach out to the actives community because they're so young. A lot of them are so young, and to navigate a public university system or private university, it's just it's just overwhelming, really. For us as a faculty, it's already overwhelming. We could imagine for them, 19-year-old, it's a lot. So we could do more.
Yeah, yeah. Steve, what else would you add?
Well, just really briefly too, just to maybe hammering this point home even harder than necessary, but just what students are doing when they're serving as activists are often exactly what we want students to be doing, right? This is what we're preparing students to be active members of communities who care deeply, who are connecting theory and practice, right? Employing critical thinking. These are 21st century skills. This is what we want students to be doing. So we can also celebrate it at the same time that we also have to figure out effective ways to respond.
Yeah. I'm also considering and thinking a little bit about, I mean, our campus, like many, had an encampment this past spring. And we also had a new president who started in March. And he plus a couple of other administrators went to the encampment with cases of water and talked with the student activists, right? Like, didn't stay in his office, but actually went and talked with it. And I think that bridge building and relationship building is kind of what you're talking about, Cher, right? Like institutionally, having and finding opportunities to listen. And sometimes that means going to where they are and not expecting them to show up at a meeting. I mean, they will do that too, right? Like they will put in their comments during the board of trustee meeting, but like when our new president went to their encampment, like it really got a lot of attention, and that encampment resolved itself peacefully. And honestly, I feel like a lot of that had to do with the relationship building that was fostered in that moment. So I'm going to switch our angle just a little bit and think a little bit about student affairs professionals who are just entering the field. A lot of our audience on this particular podcast are folks who work in entry level jobs. They've just finished a master's degree. And I'm really curious, Steve, as a faculty member in one of these types of programs, like this is a critical moment. And so if maybe this is something that's come up in your classes, but what are some of the skills and perspectives that you think, either new professionals or soon to be new professionals should be considering to effectively support student activists? Given particularly this particular moment that we are in, we're recording this right at the end of 2024 in December. So.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. That's a great question. And thank you for sharing also the story from your campus. I think that is such a real and the paradoxes. And so our new professionals are feeling that as well. And often I share a brief article from the Chronicle of Higher Education from 2009, but I think it's still relevant. It's by an author, Xenia Marcotte, who was working in a women's center at that point for about a dozen years. And Yeah, is it my job to teach the revolution is the name of the
Yes.
article. You might be familiar with it because it's a good distillation about kind of the challenge that all professionals, but I think new professionals often feel this the most because they are working very closely with undergraduate students. And the way Zemia begins the article is when I wake up in the morning and head to my job, I ask myself, will this be the day I start the revolution or will I be called upon to stop it? Right. I think our new professionals often have their feet in both camps, and so to speak. And I don't want to, I want to avoid that binary too. But there is that sense of like, I want to support students, but I also need to keep my job, and I might get in trouble. And what I talk about with our students is the importance of getting some clarity about our own motivations. And we might be fully aligned with the thrust or the goals that the students are calling for. And that's great. And we also have a job to do that might be broader than that. And so, how well does it serve us to sacrifice our position, our job, if we stand next to students with a picket sign or are marching on the administration building? Is that the best way we can serve the students and serve the goal of what the students are? Or are there other things that we can do? So Graziella talked earlier about faculty and the important place that they play in supporting students. But if we can be another voice to support students and be a place where we can validate them and they can reflect and process and figure out what they're learning from that experience, that's huge. That's crucial to slow down for a moment and not just get on to the next task, but be that place for students to just take a moment to do that synthesizing and learning. But also be a connector for students to connect them to those faculty members can be an outstanding way to serve. So we're not powerless as new professionals. There's much we can do, even if we're not on the front lines. We know activism is, as we've already said in this call, is so much more than just being out on the quad. It's all the stuff that happens behind the scenes.
Yeah. Yeah, Graciela, what would you add?
To the glorious things Steve just said, probably nothing other than, I teach an ethics and leadership class, and we always start with, all right, what matters to you? Where are you sitting? Which hill are you going to die on? And where is there room for you to take in new learning? And so I would just encourage new old professionals, seasoned folk alike, right? Like what are your values with respect to not only caring for student activists writ large, but also just students in general and serving students in general? What's key to you? What matters to you? And then follow that up with, how does that look if it's contrary to what matters to the institution, right? Start sort of doing some pre-thinking around how much conflict or where you would feel in that space of conflict. And that comes through some real honest, reflective practice. What kind of professional do you want to be? The other piece I would be really honest about is taking a look at your own sense of risk fatigue, right? How much we know the burnout rate, right? We know the true burnout rate in the helping professions, student affairs certainly being one of them. And that question that Steve just posed, like, what good are you if to the community writ large, if you're not taking care of yourself and you're not sort of taking into account how much, what you need. And so being really clear that we're talking about well-being on this podcast, but what does well-being mean for you as a new professional, seasoned professional, right? So thinking about that in the context of caring for students. And I think the last is just asking yourself a question around, what does teaching and learning mean, right? So if we're teaching and learning, what does that look like in the good times and in the bad times and in the conflict-ridden times? What is your role? What do you want your role to be? With respect to teaching and learning, and I would add dignity also. Like, what is your place in caring for, serving, supporting students, recognizing their dignity and their humanity, and their wholeness?
Yeah, really well said. Yeah, Julie.
Yeah, and I love all of those powerful small questions. Graziella always asks very small questions like, "What is the role of teaching and learning at the academy?" I love it. Um, our Vice President of Student Affairs, Rose Pascarell, talks about we need students to understand Activism 2.0, which I thought was so interesting. And she thinks some of Student Affairs' job is to do this, to teach Activism 2.0, and what she means by that. And I'm paraphrasing if I get this wrong, Rose. It's my wrong interpretation, but going beyond just like absolutism and we need this, and if this doesn't change, win lose kinds of mentalities around activism. So I think student affairs educators can also teach students to recognize compromise or win-win, the joy of finding a win-win solution, or when movement is actually happening. I don't think some of my students see change when it's actually happening. So they think they didn't capitulate to all 45 of our demands. They only met 34 of them. The institution is the devil. And I'm like, well, look at how much, you have made incremental change. And some people can argue with me about this, but I think we need to teach them to embrace both revolutionary change is Greta Thunberg, it's visible, it's sexy, but evolutionary change, much less sexy, slow paced, but also super, that's the change that are lasting, at least the way I see it. So helping, as student affairs educators, helping both students and colleagues come to that place where we can recognize what's next after the show of activism, and really get any changes made actually embedded in the institutional trajectory from there forward. So just want to add that.
Yeah, that's a great reframe. And I think it is really important to think about it as an evolutionary process, right? Because, it's no learning, bringing it back to learning, no learning happens immediately. And so it takes repetition over time. And sometimes that means, a continuous effort. But that takes a toll. And I'm thinking about this also related to my former role as the director of a women's center, where I often talked about how that work was a blend. You've heard the personal is political, right? So it's like personal is political, but in that case, it was also my job, to kind of embody, kind of to be the professional feminist activist. And that does take a toll. And so for folks who are watching, who are student affairs educators, who work in DEI spaces, work in social justice education, recognizing that sometimes those boundaries between where your professional role begins and ends and where your personal and political values and beliefs also begin and end becomes really blurry. Makes it hard to sometimes let it go, let go and also recognize when you're overwhelmed. So wellness and well-being is important for all of the folks.
Heather, I quoted Audre Lorde in my one of the chapters I worked on. That's when they said self-care is an act of political warfare, which I kind of heard in the comments that you were just making, that self-care is in itself sort of an activist strategy. So maybe we have to help people rethink that too. So
yeah, Natricia Hersey, NAP ministry, rest is resistance, and taking that into consideration for all of us, with the students and others. This has been a fabulous conversation. I think we could talk all day because we all have these really fascinating kind of backstories and history and experiences. And I'm really curious, as you kind of think forward, and this podcast is called Student Affairs Now. We always end with what are you thinking about, troubling, pondering. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, and if you have a way for folks to get in contact with you, that's great to share too. So Cher, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Heather. I've learned a lot. Wow, this is amazing. Thank you for the opportunity to, sharing our thoughts and then getting perspective from you. And for me, I'm a human rights scholar. And so human rights activists, including student activists, really, they are a special group near and dear to my heart. And so my previous research reviewed a culture of a martyrdom, as my class mentioned. So particular among older generations of activists. So basically it means a mindset rooted in an ethic of suffering, complete self-sacrifice, and a pervasive sense of guilt. So, but through this project, it has been very encouraging to observe that our younger student activists, they are more open-minded when it comes to mental health, to well-being and self-care. And this shift represents truly for me a promising cultural evolution within activism. So I'm particularly curious about how this younger student activists, they will carry this perspective beyond campus and as they graduate and engage with a broader activist community. How would they influence and reshape the larger movement? And as educators, scholars, practitioners, how can we help facilitate this transition, ensuring their commitment to well-being becomes a sustainable part of activism at all levels? And so if anyone would like to continue this conversation, please email me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. Graciela.
One of the pieces that I've been thinking about a lot in talking to our students, we asked a question about, is self-care a luxury? Left it pretty open. And many of the students said, yes, it is a luxury. And it's, it's not something that is top 10 on my list. And how can I, go and take a nap when there's so much suffering and there's so much hurt? And it makes sense. But it doesn't make sense in this idea of, part of getting student activists to matter, not only to the institution, but also to themselves, is yes, you are deserving of peace, and you are deserving of rest, and you are deserving of someone to co-carry the burden. And, so I've been thinking a lot about how do we build that type of messaging? And it speaks to worth, and it speaks to sense of self, and it maybe goes against this idea of adding value. What does it mean to add value? I'm more interested in sort of thinking about how student activists and can feel value, and enough value to take that rest in order to kind of continue the work that they do. And I'd be happy to, if anybody wants to talk further, absolutely. I welcome anyone to reach out to me, and I'm sure that we as a foursome would probably want to take them all to coffee and have really good conversation.
I love it. That's great. Julie, what are your final thoughts?
I just back from the Leadership Educators Institute, which is a program from NASFA ACPA and the National Clearinghouse for Leadership Programs. And there were many amazing sessions. My mind was blown, as it always is at that event. But I went to one by Josh Taylor and the folks from Oklahoma State University. They are doing such interesting things with Vygotsky's zones of proximal development. And, I'd forgotten, way back my education, studies this, I don't know, but it's like an enhanced version of challenge and support, right? And this idea is that when people are in panic zones or entrenched or angry, they can't learn and grow, right? And so Josh and his colleagues had this beautiful set of using inquiry to get people into learning zones. So I think activists might often find themselves in that zone of I'm hurt, I have fear, I have hurt, I have anger, these emotions that actually prevent movement or dialogue. So if someone's so in that place, how do we say what's at the root of this, and what would, how might what's happened before shape what you do tomorrow? And, there's just a set of questions I think we could ask that move people into that growth zone where maybe then we can have more sort of dialogic conversation. So I want to go try that on the student activists I work with. And I think it'd be really cool. And then also I'm so excited, it's very early stages, but Trisha Shelk and I are working on a book project around trauma-informed leadership. And I think some of the things that have happened to our activists are based on both big T, little t trauma, as Nick Fuselier taught me about. So I think thinking about where trauma is in this conversation is important. I'm finally on Blue Sky, so you can catch me at julieowen.blueskysocial. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks so much, Julie. I think I just followed you. I'm very excited about Blue Sky. Okay.
You might be the only follower.
Steve, your final thoughts.
Yeah, one of the areas that I've been focusing on for the last few years and will continue to is around this notion of authentic and critical hope, particularly in times of the rise in authoritarianism and of uncertainty and just those feelings of like anti-intellectualism that is surrounding us. And when education, I think as Paulo Freire said that education requires hope. If without hope, there is no education. But it's hard to feel hopeful when you look out and there's a lot of things to be very anxious and stressed and uncertain about. And yet, people, even in the darkest hours, have found ways of having critical hope, which is not naive and just optimism in the face of daunting odds. It's actually thinking about what can we do, how do we come together, even at the micro level, to make change. And there's some really great work that's been happening on that around activism and hope, and so some building on that. So love to continue that conversation with folks. So please do not hesitate to reach out on that.
Thank you all so much. This was a fabulous conversation, and I'm so grateful for your time and for sharing this phenomenal book. Also, we always end by sharing our gratitude with Nat Ambrosi, our incredible producer. Nat, we're so grateful for all of your efforts, and we thank you wholeheartedly for all you do. And also want to thank our episode sponsors, Evolve and Simplicity. Evolve helps senior leaders who value, aspire to lead on, and want to unleash their potential for transformational leadership. Our own Keith Edwards, along with Doctors Brian Arau and Don Lee, offer a personalized experience with high impact value. These asynchronous content and 6 individual and 6 group coaching sessions maximize your learning and growth with a focused time investment, greatly enhancing your ability to lead powerfully for social change. Our other sponsor is Simplicity. Simplicity is a global leader in student services technology platforms with state-of-the-art technology that empowers institutions to make data-driven decisions specific to their goals. A true partner to the institution, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life, including but not limited to career services and development, student conduct and well-being, student success, and accessibility services. To learn more, visit simplicity.com or connect with them on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. To all of our listeners, if you are tuning in today and haven't already subscribed to our weekly newsletter, please take a moment to enter your email on our website at studentaffairsnow.com. You will stay in the loop about our latest episodes, including a new format for future episodes focused on storytelling. And so we're really excited to launch that in the new year. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, you will be the first to know about our new podcast format. And that will be delivered to you every week on Wednesdays. And again, my name is Heather Shea. Thanks to everybody who is watching or listening. Let's make it a great week.